All right, listeners, ready to dive deep. Today we're tackling conflict resolution. And honestly, this stuff's more exciting than it sounds. You sent in this podcast, Resolving Conflicts, English Communication for Effective Leadership. And, it really got me thinking about how we can all use these skills, especially when you're trying to communicate effectively in English.
Yeah, especially in English.
I mean, let's face it, who hasn't had that moment where they wish they'd said something differently during a disagreement?
Right.
But what really surprised me about this podcast? It actually says that conflict can be a good thing.
Yeah, it kind of turns that whole idea of conflict on its head, doesn't it?
It totally does. I usually see conflict as something to, run away from.
Right.
But this podcast makes it seem like, well, how does it make it seem like a good thing?
Well, it emphasizes how when conflict's handled well, it can actually bring people closer together and lead to even more creative solutions. Think about it. When different ideas clash, right? That can create some sparks.
I see what you mean.
And those sparks can lead to some pretty amazing breakthroughs.
So it's like turning those clashes into opportunities, right? Opportunities for growth.
Exactly. And the podcast starts by giving us the essential vocabulary, the words we need to actually talk about conflict in a constructive way.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What are these magic words that can turn a conflict from a total disaster into a brainstorming session?
Well, the first one is disagreement. It seems simple, but the podcast really emphasizes that disagreement doesn't automatically mean, a huge fight.
Right.
It's just recognizing that, hey, people have different opinions and that's totally normal, especially in any team or organization.
Yeah, I think we sometimes forget that.
Totally.
We take it personally like it's an attack on us.
Exactly. But this podcast encourages us to see disagreement as just a starting point for a discussion, not a reason to shut down or get aggressive.
Okay, so disagreement, a neutral term that opens up the conversation. What else is on our vocabulary list?
Well, next up is compromise.
Compromise, yeah.
Which the podcast defines as basically an agreement where both sides make some concessions. It's not about one person winning.
Right.
It's about finding a solution that works for everyone, even if it means giving up a little something.
So it's like finding that middle ground where everyone feels, respected and heard, even if they don't get everything they want.
Exactly. And the podcast really stresses how important compromise is for building trust and keeping those relationships healthy, especially in, a professional setting.
Yeah, totally. You don't want to feel like you're being ignored or walked all the time.
Right.
Okay, compromise, check. What's next?
The next word is negotiate.
Negotiate.
Which is, the art of discussion to reach an agreement.
Right.
It's that back and forth, active listening, and that willingness to try and find solutions that meet everyone's needs, as much as possible.
So negotiate sounds like it goes beyond just settling for whatever's easiest. It's about putting in the work to find a solution that actually works for everyone.
Absolutely. And the podcast really emphasizes that negotiation isn't about manipulation or tricking people.
Right.
It's about open, honest communication, even when it gets tough.
I like that. Honesty and transparency being key in negotiation.
Oh.
All right, what else is on our list?
Well, then there's misunderstanding, which, as the podcast points out, is often at the root of many conflicts.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It happens when people interpret information differently or communication just breaks down. Sometimes it's as simple as just clarifying what you mean.
Really.
Or asking for more information before you jump to conclusions.
Oh, I can totally relate to that. So many times I've seen a simple misunderstanding turn into this huge conflict just because people didn't take a minute to clarify things.
Totally. And the podcast encourages us to be more aware of those potential misunderstandings, especially when you're communicating across cultures or in those high pressure situations.
Right. So just acknowledging that possibility of a misunderstanding can help de-escalate a situation before it blows up.
Absolutely.
All right, we're down to our last word. What is it?
The last one is mediator.
Mediator.
Which is that neutral third party who can help resolve a conflict. The podcast suggests that, bringing in a mediator can be really helpful when emotions are running high or when, the people involved just can't seem to find common ground on their own.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to, see clearly when you're in the middle of an argument. A mediator can provide that That objective perspective, right. And help people have a more productive conversation.
Exactly. It's like having a referee, in a sports game. One to make sure everyone's playing by the rules and that the focus stays on finding a fair solution.
Okay, I'm feeling like I'm learning a whole new language here.
Right.
But words alone can't always solve a conflict, right?
You're right about that. And that's where the podcast goes next, into these key phrases that can really help you navigate those different stages of conflict resolution. It's like having a toolbox filled with different tools for different situations.
Ooh, I like the idea of a toolbox. I'm ready to fill mine up. What kind of phrases are we talking about?
Well, the podcast breaks them down into these categories. Phrases for acknowledging the issue, expressing empathy, proposing solutions, and then closing the discussion.
Wow, that's smart. Like a roadmap for those tricky conversations. So let's start with acknowledging the issue. What are some phrases that can, set the right tone for the beginning?
One example they give is, I understand there's a disagreement about this. It's pretty simple, but it immediately acknowledges that there's a difference of opinion without, blaming anyone or making anyone defensive.
It's like saying, hey, I see you, I hear you, and I'm willing to talk about this. What other phrases are there for this stage?
Another one is, let's address this issue together. This one really emphasizes collaboration and that sense that you're both on the same team,
Right, yeah.
working towards a shared goal.
It's that feeling of unity instead of division, which is so important.
Exactly. And by using phrases like this, you're really setting the stage for a more productive and respectful conversation.
Okay, acknowledging the issue, check. What about expressing empathy? What phrases can help us connect with the other person's feelings and their perspective?
Well, one of my favorites from this section is, I see where you're coming from.
Oh, yeah.
It shows that you're making an effort to understand their point of view, even if you don't necessarily agree with it,
Yeah, just validating their feelings, making them feel heard, which is, I think, so important in any conflict. I mean, everyone wants to feel like their perspective matters, right?
Exactly. And it can really help de-escalate a tense situation. Another phrase they suggest is, I understand why this is important to you. Again, it's about acknowledging that their concerns are valid, even if, you have different priorities or perspectives.
Yeah, it's about finding that common ground, that human connection, right?
Exactly. And by expressing empathy, you're creating a more compassionate and understanding environment, which is key for finding a resolution that actually works for both people.
Okay, so we've acknowledged the issue, we've expressed empathy, now comes the tough part, actually proposing solutions. What phrases does the podcast recommend for this stage?
Well, one example is, how about we find a compromise? This phrase, it invites that collaboration and suggests that you're both willing to work together,
Yeah.
to find a solution that meets everyone's needs, at least partially.
I like how it frames compromise as a positive thing, not as like giving up or losing. It's about finding that win-win if possible.
Exactly. And another phrase they have is, what if we try this approach? It's a less direct way of proposing a solution, but it still encourages, that brainstorming and exploring options.
It's putting ideas on the table and seeing what works for everybody.
Right. And these phrases really help shift the focus, away from dwelling on the problem and towards actually finding a way forward.
Okay, so we've proposed some solutions. Now, what about closing the discussion? What phrases can help us wrap things up effectively?
One phrase the podcast highlights is, I'm glad we could resolve this. It's simple, but it conveys that sense of accomplishment, right?
Yeah.
Of closure, that you're both ready to move on.
It's acknowledging that you've worked through it together and reached a good outcome.
Exactly. And it reinforces that idea that conflict can be resolved, successfully through open communication and that willingness to compromise.
All right, so we've got phrases for acknowledging the issue, expressing empathy, proposing solutions, and closing that discussion. It's like a whole communication toolkit. But I'm curious, does the podcast actually show us how these phrases work in real life?
Yes, it does. And this is where it gets really interesting. They have a whole role play segment that brings all of these concepts to life.
Ooh, a role play. I love role plays.
Yeah.
Tell me more. What kind of scenario do they present?
Well, the scenario is about these two team members, and they're disagreeing about the priorities for a project. One team member thinks task A is super urgent for the client, but the other one believes task B is more important because it lays the foundation for everything else.
Oh, I've been there. Prioritizing tasks can be like a constant source of conflict, especially when you're working with people who have different perspectives and deadlines.
Totally.
So how does the conflict actually unfold in this role play?
Well, one of the podcast hosts acts as the mediator,
Okay.
and the other host plays both of the disagreeing team members.
Oh, that's clever. So you can see how a mediator can facilitate a good conversation.
Yeah, and guide the team towards a solution.
That's a great setup. So the listener can hear both sides of the argument. Walk me through it. How does it start?
Well, the role play starts with the mediator setting the stage, saying something like, "Thank you both for coming to discuss this. Let's start by understanding the issue."
Right.
It's simple, but it creates that safe space for an open and honest conversation.
I like that. It's like setting that tone of respect and collaboration right from the start. So how do the team members respond?
Well, the first team member just jumps right in and states their perspective. "I think we should prioritize task A because it's more urgent for our client." Straight to the point.
No beating around the bush there. What does the mediator do?
The mediator keeps things cool, saying, "Okay, I hear you. To person B, what are your thoughts?" Making sure that both voices are heard and each person feels respected.
Yeah. Creating that sense of balance. What does the second team member say?
The second team member shares their perspective, saying, "Well, I believe task B is actually more important because it's like the foundation for everything else. If we don't get this right, the whole project could be jeopardized."
Okay, classic clash of priorities. I'm getting nervous just listening to this. How does the mediator handle this?
This is where the mediator's skills really come in. They say, "I see where you're both coming from. Let's explore some solutions. What if we split resources and tackle both tasks simultaneously? We could assign a smaller team to focus on, the urgent aspects of task A, while a larger team tackles task B."
Whoa, smart move. It's not about choosing one task over the other. It's about finding a way to address both concerns.
Right.
How did the team members react to that?
They both seem relieved. The first one says, "That could work as long as we make sure task A stays on schedule." And the second one agrees, saying, "Yeah, that sounds fair. We just need to make sure we have clear communication between the teams."
It's a win-win. Both team members feel like their priorities have been considered and they're willing to work together.
Exactly. And the mediator wraps things up by saying, "Great. I'm glad we could find a solution that works for everyone. Let's make sure to check in with each other regularly to stay on track." It's a positive note, showing how conflict can be resolved through that open communication, empathy, and a willingness to compromise.
That role play was so helpful. It really brought those vocabulary words and phrases to life.
Didn't it?
And it shows how a skilled mediator can really guide a team towards a solution that benefits everyone. But the podcast goes beyond just the role play, right?
It does, yeah.
And it gives us some extra tips for successful conflict resolution.
Like a bonus cheat sheet.
Bonus cheat sheet. I'm all about that. What are some of the tips?
Well, one of the most important ones is staying calm, even when things get heated.
Yeah, easier said than done.
Right. The podcast really emphasizes how emotions can quickly escalate a conflict. So it's crucial to maintain that professional tone and avoid getting swept up in the drama.
It's so easy to just react, especially when you feel attacked. But usually that makes things worse.
Exactly. The podcast suggests, taking a few deep breaths, pausing before you respond, and choosing your words carefully to avoid escalating the situation.
It's about being the calm in the storm, right?
Oh.
What other tips are there?
Another key one is active listening. Really understanding the other person's perspective before you respond.
Active listening is so crucial. It's not just about hearing the words. It's about paying attention to the emotions behind them, right?
Exactly. And the podcast encourages us to use those active listening techniques, like paraphrasing what they said, asking clarifying questions, making eye contact, to show that you're engaged and you actually care about what they have to say. It's about creating that space where they feel heard and understood, which can really go a long way in de-escalating tension.
Okay, calm and composed, active listening, check and check. What else is on their list?
The next tip is to focus on solutions. Really shift the focus away from blame or dwelling on the problem and toward finding a way forward that benefits everyone.
It's about turning that negative energy into positive action.
Right. Instead of getting stuck in the past, look towards the future and find ways to create a better outcome.
And that takes effort from everyone, right?
Yeah. And the podcast suggests brainstorming solutions together, exploring different options, being open to compromise, It's approaching the conflict as a team, not as adversaries.
Remembering that you're on the same side, even when it doesn't feel like it.
Exactly.
Okay, focus on solutions. Got it. What's the last tip they highlight?
The final tip is using clear and respectful language.
Oh, yeah.
It's a reminder that communication is key, and how we say things can either make the conflict worse or better.
Words have power.
They do.
Yeah.
The podcast encourages listeners to use assertive but respectful language,
Right.
avoiding personal attacks or generalizations.
It's about being direct and honest while still being respectful. So much good stuff here. I feel like we've covered so much ground already, and we're just getting started. Where do we go from here?
Well, this episode you shared, it's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to mastering conflict resolution, but it's like a really solid foundation.
Yeah, it is. It's like we've learned the alphabet, and now we're ready to start putting those letters together to form words, sentences, whole stories.
I like that analogy, from alphabet to stories, because conflict resolution really is a journey, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And the more we learn, the more nuanced and fascinating it becomes.
I'm ready to keep exploring. What other layers of this conflict resolution onion are we peeling back today?
Well, something this podcast touches on, but it doesn't go too deep into, is the idea of conflict styles. It's like a personality test for how you typically handle disagreements.
Ooh, conflict style. I love personality quizzes. Tell me more about this.
It's basically the way you naturally approach and respond to conflict, you know?
Right.
Some people are more assertive, like they charge right in, while others are more accommodating, trying to smooth things over. Some prefer direct confrontation, while others might avoid conflict altogether.
That makes so much sense. We all have different personalities, so of course that affects how we handle disagreements. But how does knowing your conflict style actually help you in real life?
Well, it's about self-awareness, right? Once you understand your own tendencies and the tendencies of the people you're dealing with, you can start to adapt your approach, you know, and communicate more effectively.
So instead of just reacting, which might not be the best strategy, you can make more conscious choices about like how to handle the situation.
Exactly. It's like having a secret weapon in your conflict resolution arsenal.
Okay, I like that.
And there are actually some really cool models and assessments that can help you kind of pinpoint your conflict style.
I am intrigued. Tell me more about these assessments. What do they look like?
Well, one of the most popular ones is the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument.
Okay.
It identifies 5 main conflict styles:
5 style.
competing, collaborating, compromising, accommodating, and avoiding.
5 styles. Okay. Break it down for me. What does each of those styles look like in action?
Okay, so let's start with competing. This style is all about, you know, assertiveness and that drive to win.
Okay.
People with this style are very direct, forceful in their communication, and they're not afraid to stand up for what they believe in, even if it ruffles some feathers.
So it's the go big or go home approach to conflict. When would this style be effective?
Well, it can be really useful in situations where a quick decision needs to be made, or, you know, when you're dealing with someone who's trying to take advantage of you.
Right.
But it can also backfire if you come across as too aggressive or domineering. It's all about, you know, finding that balance.
Right, because no one wants to work with a dictator.
Right.
What about collaborating? What does that style look like?
Collaborating is the ultimate team player, you know? This style is all about finding win-win solutions where everyone benefits.
Okay.
People with this style are highly cooperative, great communicators, and they're willing to put in the time and effort to find a solution that everyone feels good about.
So this sounds like the ideal approach, right?
Right.
Everyone wins, happy ending. But is it realistic? Can you really achieve a win-win in every situation?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. It's a beautiful goal to strive for, but collaboration can be time-consuming, and it may not be the most efficient approach, you know, in every scenario.
Okay.
Sometimes you just need to make a quicker decision or choose a solution that's not perfect but good enough.
Right, you got to go with the flow sometimes.
Yeah.
What about compromising?
Yeah.
How is that different from collaborating?
Compromising is like a meeting in the middle. It's about finding that middle ground where everyone makes some concessions to reach an agreement. It's similar to collaborating in that it aims for a solution that works for everyone, but it's usually, you know, quicker and less demanding than trying to achieve that perfect win-win.
So it's like the choose your battles
Yeah.
approach. Sometimes it's better to just let go of some things to keep the peace.
Exactly. But, you know, it's important to be mindful that compromising can sometimes lead to a solution where no one feels truly satisfied, you know?
Right.
Just kind of meh. about it.
Right. It's about finding that balance. Right. What about accommodating? What does that style look like?
Accommodating is the peacemaker. It's characterized by putting others' needs before your own,
Right.
valuing harmony over winning. People with this style are often very selfless, generous, and they're willing to make sacrifices to keep the peace.
It sounds like a really noble approach, but could it backfire?
Yeah.
What if you're always the one giving in?
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. If you're always accommodating, you might end up feeling resentful or taken advantage of. It's important to find that balance, between assertiveness and accommodation to make sure your own needs are being met too.
Right. You can't pour from an empty cup, as they say.
Exactly.
Okay, last but not least, what about the avoiding style?
Avoiding is the master of dodging those uncomfortable conversations, right? It's about steering clear of conflict altogether, maybe by changing the subject or withdrawing from the conversation or just, hoping the issue will magically disappear.
Okay, I'll admit, sometimes avoidance feels like the easiest path,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're like conflict averse.
Yeah,
But I can also see how it could lead to bigger problems down the road.
you're absolutely right. Avoiding conflict might feel good in the short term, but those unresolved issues can fester,
Yeah.
and grow over time, damaging relationships and creating even bigger conflicts down the road.
So it's like sweeping dirt under the rug, right?
Exactly.
Eventually you trip over that pile and have a bigger mess to clean up.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that conflict, when approached constructively, can actually be an opportunity for growth and positive change.
This whole concept of conflict styles is so eye-opening. I feel like I'm seeing conflict in a whole new light.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, how do we actually put this knowledge into practice? It's not like we can just take a personality test and suddenly become conflict resolution masters, right?
You're right. It's not magic, but the first step is awareness, like we said. Once you understand your own conflict style and the styles of the people you're interacting with, you can start to adapt your approach and communicate, more effectively.
So it's about being more intentional and strategic, right?
Exactly.
Instead of just reacting instinctively.
Exactly. And the good news is that conflict resolution is a skill that can be learned and improved over time, with practice.
Okay, I like the sound of that. But practice makes perfect, right?
Yeah.
What are some ways we can actually practice our conflict resolution skills? Are there any specific exercises or activities we can do?
There are tons of great ways to practice. One of the simplest but often overlooked is just paying attention to the conflicts that arise in your everyday life,
Right.
Observe how you react in those situations.
Okay.
Notice your natural tendencies and reflect on what you could have done differently.
It's about becoming more self-aware, like recognizing those patterns in our behavior.
Exactly. And once you have a better understanding of your own conflict style, you can start to experiment with different approaches and techniques.
So it's about stepping outside of our comfort zone, trying new things, even if it feels a little awkward or uncomfortable at first.
Well, it's like learning any new skill. It takes practice and a willingness to make mistakes along the way. But the more you practice, the more confident and competent you'll become.
Okay, I'm ready to put on my conflict resolution training wheels and start practicing. What are some specific ways I can do that?
Well, one option is to seek out opportunities for conflict resolution in a safe and controlled environment,
Like what kind of opportunities are we talking about?
Think about, joining a Toastmasters club or a public speaking group.
Okay.
These organizations provide a supportive environment where you can practice your communication skills, in front of a live audience.
Okay.
Including navigating those tricky moments of disagreement or conflict.
That's a great idea. It's a conflict resolution boot camp, but in a fun and supportive environment.
Exactly. And you can also find conflict resolution workshops and training programs specifically designed to help you develop those skills.
Those sound super valuable, especially if you're looking for more structured guidance. But what if you don't have access to those types of programs or groups? Are there ways to practice conflict resolution on your own?
Absolutely. One, simple but surprisingly effective technique is role-playing different conflict scenarios,
Oh, yeah.
with a friend or a family member.
Oh, I love role-playing. It's like acting class for real life.
Exactly. And you can even use that role-play segment from the podcast we've been discussing as a starting point.
Yeah. Yeah.
You could take turns playing the mediator and the disagreeing team members, practicing those key vocabulary words, phrases, and techniques that we've talked about.
It's like a safe space to experiment and get feedback from someone you trust.
Right. And another way to practice is to seek out opportunities for what I like to call constructive disagreement in your everyday conversations.
Constructive disagreement. What does that sound like?
It's about engaging in discussions where you respectfully challenge each other's ideas and perspectives,
Right.
Not to argue or prove someone wrong, but to explore different viewpoints and deepen your understanding of the issue.
So it's about turning those disagreements into like opportunities for learning and
Right,
growth.
yeah.
For expanding our perspectives and challenging our assumptions.
Exactly. And the more we practice engaging in constructive disagreement, the more comfortable we'll become, with conflict.
Right.
And the better we'll become at navigating those tricky conversations with grace and skill.
I love that. It's about like reframing conflict as a positive force rather than something to be feared or avoided.
Right. And it's a reminder that even in disagreement, there can be connection and understanding.
This has been so insightful. I'm feeling much more equipped to handle conflict effectively. But before we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more crucial aspect of conflict resolution that I think is often overlooked. The importance of self-care.
Oh, that's so crucial.
Yeah.
We can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. Conflict can be emotionally draining, and it's so important to prioritize our own well-being throughout the process. What are some self-care practices that can help us, stay grounded and resilient when we're dealing with those tricky situations?
Well, one of the most basic yet often neglected self-care practices is simply getting enough sleep.
Oh yeah. Sleep is so important.
When we're sleep deprived, we're more likely to be irritable, reactive, and less capable of clear thinking.
So true. I know I'm a total grump when I don't get enough sleep, and even the smallest things can set me off. A good night's rest can make a world of difference in how we handle stress.
Absolutely. And another essential self-care practice is making time for activities that bring us joy and help us relax,
Okay, yeah.
Whether it's reading, listening to music, spending time in nature, connecting with loved ones, whatever fills your cup.
Yeah.
It's crucial to carve out time for those activities that nourish our souls and replenish our energy.
It's about finding those outlets that help us de-stress and recharge.
Yeah.
Maintain that balance.
Exactly. And it's also important to be mindful of our physical health,
Yeah.
Exercise, healthy eating, staying hydrated. These things can all make a big difference in how we manage stress and handle conflict effectively.
It's about taking care of our bodies so that we're better equipped to handle those emotional and mental challenges that conflict can bring.
You got it. And don't forget about boundaries. It's so important to know our limits and to be willing to say no when we need to.
Boundaries are essential, especially when you're dealing with difficult people or situations that just drain your energy.
Right. And finally, remember the power of a support system, whether it's friends, family, colleagues, or a therapist.
Yeah.
It's so valuable to have people we can talk to,
Right.
vent to, get support from when we're feeling overwhelmed or stressed.
Having that safe space to process your emotions and get a fresh perspective.
Exactly.
This can make a world of difference.
It really can. And I think it's important to remember that self-care isn't, selfish. It's actually essential for showing up as our best selves for others and for handling, conflict in a healthy and productive way.
Beautifully said. I feel like we've covered so much ground in this deep dive already, but I'm excited to see where we go next. What other nuggets of wisdom are waiting for us in part 3?
Welcome back to our deep dive into conflict resolution.
It's kind of amazing how much this stuff applies to what we see happening in the world today.
Right. It feels like everywhere you look, there's like conflict and division, people
Yeah.
just talking past each other. Honestly, sometimes it makes me want to just like hide.
Yeah, I hear you. It can be overwhelming for sure. But that's exactly why these skills are so important, not just for ourselves, but like for the bigger picture, you know?
Okay, but how do we even begin to apply what we've learned about like conflict resolution to those massive global issues? Those feel so much bigger.
You're right, the scale is definitely different. But the core dynamics, they're surprisingly similar. Think about it. Most conflicts, whether it's a fight with your roommate or, you know, a geopolitical standoff, it really boils down to differences in perspectives and needs and goals.
So you're saying that even in those huge global conflicts, it still comes back to communication and empathy and finding that common ground. And just like in our personal lives, effective communication is key. It's about creating those spaces for dialogue, really listening to understand the other side, and searching for solutions that benefit as many people as possible.
It's about like building bridges instead of walls.
Exactly.
But honestly, it's hard to imagine how these like individual skills we've been talking about can actually make a difference in those like huge global problems.
I get it. It's easy to feel powerless when you look at like the state of the world. But I truly believe that change starts with each of us. The more we practice these skills in our own lives, the more we contribute to a culture of understanding and compassion and peaceful problem solving.
It's like a ripple effect, right?
Yeah.
Their individual actions, even small ones, can like inspire others and create a more positive environment.
That's it. And even small acts of kindness, empathy, and understanding can have a huge impact over time. It's about shifting our mindset from us versus them to like, we're all in this together.
I love that. It's a reminder that like we're all connected, and our actions, no matter how small, can make a difference in creating a more peaceful world.
Exactly. And the podcast that we've been deep diving into today, it reminds us that even global conflicts, they don't have to be purely destructive. They can be opportunities to learn, grow, and work towards a more just and equitable world.
That's a really hopeful message.
Yeah.
It makes me feel like I can actually do something.
That's the spirit. And remember, it all starts with those individual actions, those conversations we have, the choices we make, those moments where we choose understanding over judgment.
You're so right. It's not about waiting for someone else to fix the world.
Right.
It's about each of us taking responsibility
Yes.
for creating the kind of world we want to live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. But before we wrap things up, I want to challenge our listeners to think about one key takeaway from this deep dive.
Okay, I'm up for the challenge. What's the one thing you hope our listeners will remember, like long after this episode is over?
For me, it's the reminder that conflict is just a natural part of life.
Yeah.
It's not something to be feared or avoided, but rather something to be navigated with skill and empathy and a commitment to finding, solutions that work for everyone.
That's so important. It's about like shifting our perspective and seeing conflict not as a threat, but as an opportunity.
Exactly. And remember, that applies to everything from our personal relationships to those big, complex global issues.
I love that. It's a message of like hope and empowerment and the belief that we can create a more peaceful world, one conversation at a time.
Exactly. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into conflict resolution. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Thank you for being such a fantastic guide. This has been so insightful and empowering.
It was my pleasure.
And to our amazing listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you some new tools and perspectives to help you navigate conflict more effectively.
Remember, conflict is inevitable, but it doesn't have to define us. With the right mindset and a commitment to understanding, we can turn those challenges into opportunities for growth, connection, and positive change.
Until next time, keep those conversations flowing, keep those minds open, and remember, even in the face of conflict, there's always hope.